Hello friends, so let us move to the next example of emissions calculations for different type of emissions. Okay, the next example is scope 3 emission, again purchase goods, so we are purchasing furnitures. Okay, let's say number of units multiplied with the factor emission factor. Again we adopt the life cycle assessment approach. We get the information relevant to supplier data for emission factors. Multiply 200 units with the emission factor, you will get the answer for that. The emissions coming from basically the production, transportation and material which is used in manufacturing office furnitures. So again we utilize the life cycle assessment approach, okay, to see in which phase what amount of emissions are taking place. Then scope 1 emissions, GHG emission from the fuel combustion. We have a diesel generator where we are consuming diesel around 100 liters. This is the emission factor, standard diesel emission factor, which is sourced from, let's say, EPA, IPCC websites, and this is the calculation, total quantity of diesel consumed multiplied with the emission factor. So basically direct emissions from diesel combustions in the generators, and this is generating emissions of CO2 and particulate matters. Okay, next example is scope 3, employees are traveling for business. So let's say train travel, 500 kilometers travel, this is the emission factor, average emission from the train transport, emission factor source EPA. Okay, this is the calculation, total kilometers multiplied with the emission factors. So emissions from the fuel used for train travel, typically diesel or electricity from the grid depending upon the region. So this is also we can consider a great example for scope 3. Next, scope 3 is about upstream transportation using the ocean freight, okay, ships, and let's say 1000 kilometers multiplied with the emission factor. We have these emission factor from the maritime shipping emission factor source, and reference is EPA. Okay, and so emissions from the transportation of goods via ships, and which is basically powered by diesels or bunker fuels. Okay, so this is the calculation, 1000 kilometers multiplied with the emission factors. Then again scope 1 emissions, GHG emissions from the industrial processes. Let's take example of the cement productions. Okay, we are producing 100 tons of cement, and the emission factor for this is 1.25 kg CO2 equivalents per kilogram of production of the cement. Okay, so we have taken this example of emission factor from IPCC for cement. IPCC is the source. So CO2 emissions from the heating of limestones and the chemical process used in cement production. So if you see here, 100 tons converted into kilograms, okay, because this emission factor is in kilogram. So then multiply with the emission factor, you will get the answer for the total emissions. Next example for scope 1, GHG emissions from natural gas combustions. Again, what is the purpose of using the natural gas? That is for a heating purpose required. So what is the quantity of the gas is used? That is 1500 cubic meters. Multiplied with the emission factor, you will get the answer for this. But what is the source of emission factor? Like from EPA, IPCC website, standard emission factor for the natural gas we are using. So as the natural gas is burned to heat the buildings or equipment, in this process releasing the CO2. So this is how we get the calculation done actually. Scope 2, next, again example like using electricity for lighting purpose. This was the similar example what we have discussed earlier, indirect emissions from the purchased electricity. So we have the amount of electricity consumed and the emission factors, which is from the regional grid mix factors, basically from the local utility sources or local utility providers. Okay, this is the calculation done. Okay, these emissions from electricity generation that supplies the building's lighting, where the grid energy is derived from a mix of coal, gas or renewables also. Scope 3, waste generated in the operations. Let's say taking example of the cardboard disposal, cardboards, okay, which is quite frequently generated as a waste in the processes, okay, because we are utilizing it for the packaging purpose. 2000 kg of the cardboards, this is the emission factor. Again, that is going to the landfill, so landfill emission factors for the cardboard, okay. Let's say, suppose, as we are sending it for landfill, let's say as an example, okay, so emission factor source APA, multiply the total quantity with the emission factor, then you will get the answer for this, okay. Then emissions are produced as cardboard which decomposes in the landfill and generating CO2 and methane under the anaerobic conditions, okay. So these will lead to the total emissions or contribute to the total emissions related to the cardboard disposal. Next is about the another example of scope 3, which is basically capital goods like construction material we are purchasing, okay. Let's say 500 tons. This is the emission factor. These emissions from manufacturing, transportation of the construction material. So the emission factor will be sourced from manufacturer reports, and the emissions from the extraction, production, transportation of the material used in the construction projects. Again, LCA approach will be very helpful in this case actually. So we will know in each phase what is the emission generated. Next example, scope 1, direct GHG emissions from the chemical manufacturing process. So we are taking example of the chemical production plant, okay. Total quantity of the chemical produced is 10,000 kg. This is the emission factor per kg of the chemical produced. As per the IPCC chemical production guidelines, we can source this emission factor. This is the calculation: total quantity of the chemical produced multiplied with this emission factor. So emissions are basically being produced in the manufacturing process of chemicals, which includes energy uses, emissions, and also the process emissions for the chemical productions. And in scope 2 example, like indirect emissions from purchased electricity required for the cooling system. This is the electricity consumption. It is quite similar example what we have seen earlier, like during the cooling, for the cooling equipment we need the power supply or electricity supply, which comes from a combination of fossil fuels and renewables. The next scope 3 is employee commuting, utilizing public transportation. Previously we discussed the example with the car commuting, personal cars. Now we are talking about the public transportation. So that's the distance traveled, 5,000 kilometers, emission factor per kilometer basis. So public transport emission factors sourced like from the EPA website. This is the calculation for this. Emissions are basically generated from the public transport vehicles such as buses, trains, which are used by employees, okay. So these are different types of examples related to scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. We'll take more examples, friends. Thank you.